Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. Today I want to talk to you about why I would choose a nucleus colony over a 3-pound package of bees for getting started with bees. And that is especially true if you're a beginner. Let's talk about what is involved in both products first, and then the advantages and disadvantages of them. A package of bees comes in a wooden box like this. Inside it there would be a can of sugar syrup which keeps the bees fed. In this screen cage, which allows a good airflow, you would have typically 3 pounds of bees. 3 pounds of bees is roughly 13,000 bees or so. There's a bit over 4,500 bees to the pound. These bees have been reared in a part of the country where it's a lot warmer than it is up here in the north, and that means that the colonies have grown quickly, and so they've been able to produce a big surplus of bees for them to actually harvest and sell their bees. And to do that, they quite literally take supers, put them on a shaker, shake the bees out. They go through a funnel. Then the funnel fills up one of these packages. When it weighs 3 pounds, they stop it and move to the next one and put the next package in, shake another 3 pounds into the next package, put another 3 pounds in the next package, and so on. And that means that these packages are basically an artificial swarm or a group of bees, which is sufficient to start up a new hive, but it's queenless. So someone else's role is to grow queens in queen cage and put them into queen cages. Now, the reason is that each of these groups needs their own queen. So someone else's job is growing queens, grafting them, getting them to emerge. They fly, they mate. Someone goes onto this little mating nuke, takes the queen out, puts her inside the cage, maybe puts a few attendant bees in there to keep her looked after, puts a cork in it, and now the queen is ready to go into a new group of bees to form a new colony. So she's suspended in this group of bees in here, separated by a cage and a very clever time release mechanism here, which basically keeps that queen protected, keeps her stored in here, because a brand new queen in a package of bees is going to be killed if she gets out right away. Over a period of 5 days, 6 days or so, the pheromones from the queen get passed throughout the bees. The bees likewise just gradually become accustomed to the smell of the new queen. Now, after roughly 5-6 days together, the queen is allowed out of the cage, and the way that's done is a cork is removed from the candy end of the cage here, and the bees can eat their way. This cork is removed. The bees can eat their way through this candy, and eventually this queen, once this candy has been eaten up, the queen can get out of the cage. We rely on the fact that it takes another 2 to 3 days for them to eat their way through the candy so that the queen can get out of the cage, and now it's been probably a week or so that they've been together, and these bees will usually accept that new queen. The problem is that things can go wrong. There's a lot of things which affect the likelihood of whether the bees will accept that new queen. Even though she may have got out for a day or two, sometimes they'll turn on her. Number one, bad weather. So if the bees are confined to the colony and the older bees are staying in the hive, the older bees are much less likely to accept the new queen, and so there's a risk that she dies if you get your package and the first week or two it's bad weather. Next thing is, it can be that if you disturb the colony too much, and with a new hive you have to disturb the colony to, number one, make sure the queen is out of the cage, and number two, the queen is laying eggs. So during those couple of times that you go into the hive, that disturbance may be just enough to get these bees to turn on that queen and kill her. So there is a downside with packages. There are some advantages as well, which we will talk about. But at any rate, that would be a package of bees. The alternative is a nucleus colony. Nucleus colonies typically contain 5 frames. You can make 2-frame and 3-frame and 4-frame nukes, but the typical thing that people will buy, say in the Northeast, would be a 5-frame nuke. My 5-frame nukes happen to be usually sold in these cardboard boxes with a lid here. 5 combs, drawn deep combs in here. The nucleus colony, the queen is already the mother of the bees in this colony. There is no question of whether these bees will turn on that queen, because she's been accepted. Even with newly made up nukes, typically that queen has been in that colony for 3 or 4 weeks. So you've gone past the danger point at which they may turn on a nuke that was made from a nuke with a new queen. Probably most nukes that are sold have the queen in there for considerably longer. Sometimes it's a overwintered nuke, which it's worth paying a premium for. At any rate, a nuke has much fewer problems than a package. Now, let's go over the advantages and disadvantages. With a package, there's the one main advantage is you're saving some money. Typically, a package of bees will cost you, for like queens we're talking about a package costing you $50 to $70 less than a nuke will cost you. But in my view, that $50 to $70 is well worth the money, and we'll talk about why. The other advantage of a package is they're sometimes available earlier than you can get a nuke. And so if you have a particular reason to need your bees started earlier in the season, a package has the edge in that they're usually available because they can be trucked up from the south, usually before nukes are available either locally or before nukes are being trucked up from the south. But if you can get them at the same time, then they've lost their advantage there. And I used to want to get a package for various reasons. I sometimes wanted to save the money, and sometimes I just couldn't wait till May to get my nuke. I had to get them in April. The earlier in April I could get them, the better. But over time you learn that getting your bees early isn't necessarily a good thing. Your fun starts earlier. Yes, that's true. You can play with your bees earlier, and if you know what you're doing, generally you'll be able to troubleshoot any problems associated with getting your bees early. But for a beginner, the problems that are associated with getting the bees early can very often lead to the colony dying. For instance, it's much harder to feed the new bees when it's cold. Here in we can have snow in April, we can have snow in May here in Maine. And so starting a package in April can be quite problematic. You can't just simply rely on putting an entrance feeder on the hive, because when you put a package of bees into a hive, they have no food in there. If you've got a colony which is just foundation, all you've got is the food that you can supply them with, and that's either through an entrance feeder or a hive top feeder. And so depending on the weather, you need to take precautions to make sure that you feed them in time and adequately and in a way that the bees can get at despite the cold weather. You folks in the south reading this won't quite understand, may not appreciate the difficulties you can have associated with feeding a new package. Because here in Maine, if you use an entrance feeder to try and feed a package and the weather doesn't get above 35 degrees, the bees will starve to death, because they may be clustered in a hive right here and the entrance feeder is right here, but they'll starve to death because they can't leave that cluster to get down 2 inches to the feeder. And even if they did, the feed is so cold that it'll be extremely difficult for them to take much sugar syrup without being in trouble themselves or chilling the bee themselves. So we have to put a feeder at the top of the cluster in order to keep them fed. So feeding can become an issue. But the problems associated with the package is really where the differences between the nuke and the package come. With a package, even under normal circumstances, you might get 1 or 2%, maybe as many as 5%, depending on the conditions that they were shipped in, where the queen is dead on arrival. Now, with most good package suppliers, they're going to have spare queens for just that sort of purpose. Any reputable supplier of packages will supply you with a replacement queen should your package arrive with the queen dead on arrival. So that's why you have to check. As soon as you go to install your bees, you check that the queen is in good shape, because if she's not, you can get a replacement right there and then. So make sure you do that if you're getting packages. But after the initial dead on arrival issue, which is relatively rare, 1 or 2%, you're now talking about the problem of the loss of the queen in the first week or so, where the queen gets out of the cage and they kill her straight away. I would say that happens in the order of 5, maybe 10% of times, even under reasonably good circumstances. If it's good weather, I'd say it's nearer 5%, and if it's bad weather, I'd say it's more than 10%, maybe 10 to 15%, where the bees just turn on the queen, even though you didn't disturb them again from that point on. Subsequent to that, the queen can be lost because they supersede her. And that's very common. And I would say that happens between 10 and 30% of packages will replace the queen at some time over the next couple of months. And they will supersede it by taking one of the eggs that she's produced and create a new queen. And generally speaking, that will work fine. It'll set the colony back by another week or so, maybe 2 weeks, because we have to have time. Once that new queen emerges, she will then kill her mother, and then she's got a mate, and it might be a week before she's emerged, mated, and starting to lay. The question is, maybe on 10 to 15%, 20% of the times you have a new virgin queen going out to mate, she doesn't make it back. She's killed on her mating flight. So whereas we have 10 to 30% of the colonies replacing their queen, of those that replace the queen, we may lose another 20% of those bees, of those colonies, because the new queen didn't make it back from her mating flight. So that is the real drawback of packages, is that you have a significantly increased probability of losing the bees. And then on top of that, of course, feeding. It's going to take some time. You've got to feed them, and they're totally dependent on your feeding. But secondly, it's the fact that there is no brood to start with. It means that from the time you start your package to the time that the bees start to grow in population, it's going to be about 4 weeks. Remember, it's going to take them a few days to let the queen out. The queen may not start laying right away. She normally does. And then it takes 21 days for that, from the day the egg is laid to the day that the first bees start to emerge from the brood. So from the time you install, your population is going down during the time that you're waiting for your new brood to emerge. But from then on, typically, you're good to go. On the other hand, the nuke. The nuke, starting off with 5 combs of bees in there. So that's roughly the same number of bees in a nuke as you would have in a package. But on top of that, within those 5 combs, you'll have usually 3, maybe 4 frames, sometimes 5, with a lot of brood in them. The middle 3 frames are usually pretty full of brood. And that means that each comb has roughly 5,000 to 6,000 young bees developing in there. And that means that in that first 3 weeks, from the time you start your nuke to the time so 3 weeks later, you've probably doubled or tripled the population that you would have had you had a package, because you've not only got the majority, you've got a lot of the bees here which will die off just like the package would do, but you've got replacement bees coming through, 20,000 or so developing bees coming through very nicely. So that means that this colony is roughly 4 weeks ahead of this one if you started them at the same time. If you started your package early, it's going to take them 4 weeks to be at the same state that it would be had you got a nuke a month later. So the advantage of starting early, the only advantage of starting early is, one, that you can play with your bees early, and number 2 is if you have something that you have to pollinate in the interim that before you could have got a nuke, that's where packages can be an advantage as well. I would say that the $50 to $70 difference between the two is insignificant, even just taking into the fact that you've got 4 or 5 combs already built in your colony. So forgetting about the extra bees, you've got 5 drawn combs in there, which is like gold dust for a brand new colony. So when you're feeding your bees, typically you're going to be feeding these bees with the package for about 2 months. With a nuke, well, in theory, you could get away without feeding them because they've already got some food stored in here, so they're not as vulnerable to underfeeding as a package might be. As well as 3 to 4 frames of brood, the remaining space is full of pollen, full of nectar or honey, so the bees have plenty of food in here, even if for some reason you weren't feeding them adequately. You've got a lot of leeway with a nuke usually. Now, and also if you feed them, they can store it immediately, whereas a package here, would have to build comb before they can actually store any food. These guys have already got the comb already built, so if you feed them, they can fill up empty space in that nuke right away. So nukes are much less vulnerable to starvation issues compared to a package. But typically, they have built both a comb in the first deep super within a week to 2 weeks, and in the second deep super another 2 weeks later. So typically you're going on to your honey super after 4 to 5 weeks, whereas it's going to be 8 to 9 weeks before this package is able to put its first honey super on under normal circumstances. But the real critical thing is the difference in the potential for losing your queen here and the very low probability of losing a queen here because she's already well established. One thing I would say you have to be careful of when you're ordering a nuke, though, is that you get your nuke from a reputable dealer. The problem where you have nukes coming from, say, migratory beekeepers, there is a problem there. I mean, some of them are going to produce you a very good product. Some may not produce you a very good product. I'll give you an example of how things can go wrong if you don't get your nukes from a reputable dealer. I used to get nukes before I started to produce my own, from a migratory beekeeper who would bring nukes up from the south to pollinate in the blueberry barrens here in Maine. And he'd advertise in the paper very inexpensive nukes. I thought, that's good value. I would go for that. And I would order them. I'd meet him in the blueberry fields. I'd get my dozen nukes from him and I'd bring them back home. And I would go through them the next day and I'd find that 1 in 3 had no queen. Now I could see that clearly those nukes were made from splits only a couple of weeks ago because there were queen cells or broken up queen cells, emerged queen cells in the nuke, but some nukes would have lots of honey in, relatively few bees, no brood, and just an empty queen cell there. And then clearly in those circumstances the queen had emerged and not returned from a mating flight, so the colony never produced any brood. 2 out of 3 would usually be in pretty good shape, and I'd be pleased with that. But the problem was that I returned, say, 1/3 of my nukes, 4 out of 12 or so, and I would get all sorts of abuse saying, well, where are the bees and where's the brood? You just switched out frames of honey and that sort of thing. And fortunately, I knew what I was looking at, and I could argue my case and say, look, I want replacement nukes here. These didn't have a queen. But I was also just at the point I was teaching my beekeeping at that stage, and I knew there's a few of my students who were at that time buying nukes from the same source, and they wouldn't have had a clue that it was because they were sold a faulty product. And so it just drove home to me how important it is that the place that you get your nuke from is got to be someone that you can rely upon. And for those who didn't recognize they had a problem with their nuke, if they realize a few weeks later, or somebody told them, look, you didn't have a queen in this nuke, you want to get a replacement nuke, the migratory beekeeper is left now, he's gone to pollinate elsewhere. And so This is the problem there. You want to get your nukes from someone you can go back to if there's a problem. And I have maybe out of 350 nukes last year, I've had to replace 2 or 3 where something went wrong, and I said, I want to make sure that that product is right, and here's your new nuke. And that is sometimes a problem that I may have overlooked. More likely it was something that was done wrong when they got there. They accidentally killed the queen on the day that they transferred the frames, which could happen, of course. So if you're moving frames around, you can accidentally kill the queen. It's pretty rare, but it still happens, maybe 1% of the time. And in that case, I'm going to cover that because it looks like I supplied a nuke that didn't have a queen, for example. So I don't want to have that sort of issue. So the long and short of it is, packages have their place. It's fun to get started early, but I would far rather put that extra money into a brand new nuke, which is going to give me a 4-week head start. For the extra 50 or 60 bucks, just those frames are worth it, never mind the extra bees and the extra time involved. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.